Hello, everybody. Very happy to be live with a brilliant panel of three tonight. Do you want to start us off with an introduction to yourselves and your book, starting with Lizzie, because you're at the top?
Hello, my name is Lizzie Pook, and I'm the author of Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter, which has a bit of a shiny cover you may or may not be able to see. It is a historical mystery set against the backdrop of the dangerous pearl diving industry in 19th century Western Australia. Our protagonist is Eliza Brightwell, a young, strong-willed British woman whose family has sailed across to the remote community of Bannin Bay to set up in the dangerous and brutal pearl diving industry. And one day her father, the captain of a pearling lugger, goes missing from his ship under suspicious circumstances and is presumed dead, but it falls to Eliza to uncover the truth of what's actually happened to him. And as she scours the streets of Bannin Bay and the mangroves and the seas beyond, she uncovers corruption, prejudice, blackmail, and lots of long-buried secrets.
Fabulous. Cate, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. It sounds like such a great book. I'm so looking forward to reading that one. It's a great title too.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm listed here as Catherine Quinn, but my writer's name is Cate Quinn. We had a little discussion about that before because it wouldn't fit on the cover. So this is my book, Blood Sisters, set in outback Australia. I loved writing this book. It's a book about two American backpackers who have ended up working in a kind of rough gold diggers. Sorry, gold diggers. I don't know where I got oil riggers from. Hub in outback Australia, and one night there is a lock-in, and one of the grab handy locals is found brutally murdered the next morning. The two backpackers are quickly arrested and look to have very possibly done the crime. And people in the local town certainly think that they seem very guilty. The girls say they didn't do it, but they also swear the dead guy had it coming, and say they don't remember anything about the night. So it's an unpicking of what happened that night and events leading up to it, to lead to this guy being murdered.
Emma?
It's a great book. It's both Lizzie and Cate's books are amazing. So yeah,
as is yours.
As is yours, yeah.
So my debut is No Country for Girls. It's a pacey, high-stakes road trip thriller about two teen girls, Charlie and Nao, who take off along 2,000 kilometres of remote highway in Western Australia. This is after a somewhat bloody incident at the end of chapter 1 that leaves a man dead on Charlie's kitchen floor. These two characters don't know each other at the start of the book. They certainly don't trust each other. I gave myself the challenge of writing a Thelma and Louise style story, but I wanted to throw two characters together that didn't know each other. It's been described by Lizzie, although Lizzie's not the only person who has said this. It's been described as Thelma and Louise meets The Tourist, and it is my love letter to road movies, high-octane thrillers, and the West Australian outback. I grew up in Western Australia, and I always write books set there. Yeah, that'll do.
Fabulous. So you kind of touched on that, but my first question, but before we get there, you got some hellos already from Laura, Donna, and Sam.
Hey guys.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
I don't think you can reply in the chat, otherwise I'd say hello, but probably best I don't.
To start off with then, why did you pick sort of an Australian location for your books? And you're all in kind of a similar part of Australia, I think, with your novels. So why that particular region as well?
Who wants to go first?
Emma.
I'll start if you like. So, well, like as I said, I've lived in the UK now for like 30 years. All my family are in Western Australia, and I've been homesick for the place pretty well for that whole 30 years. So I started writing out of homesickness. It's a really great way to connect with the place. So it was always going to be set there. But I think, yeah, the choice of the actual setting, it did actually change, because I started, first of all, I was doing a writing exercise on a creative writing course, and these two characters appeared, and they appeared in Cate Cemetery, which is the cemetery that was across the street from the high school where I went in Perth. And I knew as soon as I met these two characters that I wanted to send them on this road trip. I'd had this Thelma and Louise story idea for a while. And initially, because I knew there was a gold theft in the story, I just was going to send them to the goldfields, which is probably more similar to where Cate's book is set, actually. And I did this the last time, before the pandemic, the last time I made it home to Western Australia was early 2019. So I do this little road trip with my dad, which I'd never done a road trip with my dad before. That was fun, actually. It was really interesting. And I realised it was way too short. Like I couldn't, like you can get there in like 5 hours. So it was just like, okay, I can't, this is not going to work for this story. So that's why I had to relocate it. I wanted it still to be within Western Australia, but I knew that it was going to go north to the Kimberley. And I have I've been up to Broome quite a few times. I haven't been very much further in the Kimberley, but that landscape is amazing. I'm sure Lizzie will say more about that. But yeah, it was mainly because I needed scale. I needed big distances. I needed spectacular country. And I love that desert landscape, which looks like it doesn't have anything in it, but actually there's so much going on in it. So that's why I picked that.
Great answer.
Okay.
On the next. So my book is, I suppose, interestingly, it's a different, for a very different reason, really, in that it's to do a lot more with the culture of that particular town. So my town is set in it's a mining town, and personally, I've worked as well all kinds of jobs really around Australia, but I have worked as a waitress and as a barmaid, and I was always struck as a Brit going around Australia by the culture of skimpy barmaids, because we don't have that in England. Well, I don't think we have that in England, not really. I definitely remember being very shocked as a younger backpacker, seeing like what would be in England like a family pub, like a typical classic pub on the street, not hidden away, no dark windows, with like an advertisement for like, you know, bikini clad or like topless barmaids on a Wednesday or something. And which is really, and that culture really intrigued me. And I think the fact, because it's so remote, it's a slightly different, and there's people who work, there's towns that are predominantly peopled hugely disproportionately by men, so that the culture shifts in terms of what those men are looking for and what becomes normalized. And a lot of what I explored in the book, and what I really enjoyed exploring, was how, as people, for any human being, including the barmaids in my book, the characters in my book, things become normalized for us that initially would have been quite shocking. So in the beginning of the book, the barmaids are shocked by the men's kind of ready access to pornography, or the sort of things they might be looking at on their phones, the amount of alcohol they drink. And then by the end of the book, that sort of sets in for these girls, and they realise they're drinking more, it's become more normal for them. Those lines are becoming blurred. So actually, whilst the landscape and the land is a real factor in that, just because of what you're pulling out of the earth, and actually how you're kind of digging up and exploiting the earth, it kind of becomes a bit of a metaphor to me about how that impacts on the human beings, and how the exploited earth then is represented in the human beings that are living and doing that sort of exploiting. So different reasons, right? Pretty different.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Although, actually, Can I just jump in quickly? Only just, we might get more time to talk about this. Actually, those similar themes about, yeah.
Oh yes, of course there is. Yes, but you come from a different.
Well, because it's got the gold in it, so it's that similar theme of, yeah, in a sense, taking from the country that is not yours, was definitely in my book too.
Yeah, and
I might say
impact a generation down, hasn't it?
It's just a different, in a different way. In a different way.
Well, I think all the books have that in, because my book is literally about pearl diving, which is diving for shell and bringing it up and finding pearls and taking them from the earth. So my story again is a little bit different to everybody else's, but obviously I'm not Australian, and I never set out and said, oh, I'm going to write a book and I want it to be about Australia. I'm a firm believer in the notion of an idea finding you, and an idea sort of getting its claws into you, and if it's the right one, if it's the right idea for your book, it's not going to let you go. So I'm not Australian, but I have sort of turned to Australia and fled to Australia in quite difficult times in my life. Most prominently when my dad passed away, my sister and I flew across to Australia, as far away as we could get from the UK, and drove a car through the outback. Basically, we drove from Sydney to Darwin through the middle of the country, and then we flew over to Western Australia and did some more driving over there. And it was while I was in Western Australia that the initial idea for my book came about, and that was learning about families that sailed across from the UK, taking that sort of months-long sail across to very, very remote parts of Western Australia, and setting up in this fledgling industry, which was and still is one of the most dangerous occupations in the world. So hard hat diving, where people would descend to the bottom of the ocean in these heavy sort of copper helmets and suits to dive for shell, and they would come up against sharks, storms, crocodiles, they'd die of the bends. It was so brutal, and I just became absolutely fascinated by that industry. And I ended up in a place called Broome, which is a place that Emma mentioned, which is in the sort of far northwest reaches of the Kimberley. And Broome really is one of the most beautiful places you could ever see. It's got that sort of chalky turquoise sea, that bright red crimson soil. It's just like something from a calendar, but it has this really dark history with pearl diving, with Aboriginal slavery. In its first incarnation, Broome was a very sort of swaggering, almost Wild West town where lots of dark, dirty deeds happened. And I just became completely fascinated by that part of Australia, that part of Australian British history. And that's when the idea for my book came about. So it's interesting that we've all sort of come to it in different ways, but actually all our books do share really similar themes, which is interesting.
And all from a deep knowledge of like where you've been and visited as well, which is really good.
I think some places just stick with you. Like Emma was born there, but it's never left her. She feels compelled to write about it. Cate was fascinated by a particular part of the culture that she experienced when she was there, and that never left her. I think the best settings for books are just will never leave you, and you almost have to write about them.
When I was reading No Country for Girls, I particularly liked a description. You've got them driving through a storm, Emma, and you described the storm as being epileptic, which I thought was brilliant. Is that a particularly Australian saying? And when we go around, what's your best description do you think you've got in your books, Cate and Lizzie?
So you can't ask an answer. Do you know how many words we write? That's like 1,000 words. We love every one of those.
I can think of I'll think of something for those their two books. If they can't, I'm sure they will.
You know what I really like to do though, what's really fun as an author is when your book comes out on Kindle, you get people highlight, and it's really fun to kind of go back and like you can see them also. You can see like what resonated, and it is often I find that the phrases that in my case that I felt like particularly proud of. I haven't done that with Blood Sisters yet. I should go take a look, shouldn't I?
No, I need to look at that too. Yeah, I think sense of place is so important for crime as well. And if you're writing about Australia, it just offers amazing landscapes up in spades, and Emma particularly with No Country for Girls, because you've literally got two characters in a car driving through this landscape. You must have had to come up with loads of different ways to describe what they were going through, because it can be quite samey.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that was one of the joys of those two characters, is that they have such different responses to the landscape. And well, just to go back to Kaz, your question about the word epileptic. In fact, that's just a very Charlie word. Like, no one else would probably use that. It's definitely not a particularly Australian way of describing something, but it's a word that she uses. And actually, there are other places where she talks about chucking a tantrum. I think she might even say chucking an epi tantrum. And what she means there is also the word epileptic. But one of my early readers, a friend of mine from high school, I got a few Australian people to read it quite early. She was like, she didn't get that. She was like, I don't get that word, Emma. She wanted me to change it to epic. But I knew that it was Charlie's word, epileptic. I thought it's fine. Like, no one else would probably use that word, but it's very her. But yeah, like I said, that was one of the joys of these two characters, where they have such different responses to the landscape. And, you know, they're very different. They've got very different background. Nao is a young First Nations woman, but she has grown up. Her Aboriginal dad died when she was quite young. So she's grown up with her mum, who is white, and her stepfather, who is white. And Charlie has grown, and Nao has grown up in relative privilege, and Charlie has grown up very poor. And yeah, so and actually, in the sense, neither of them have really spent time out of the city in this landscape. So I did have a lot of fun with their very different responses to it. That was a great joy.
I've thought of an answer to the question, Kaz, at the opening line of my book that I completely forgot.
That's what I would have said.
Yes. At the opening line is,
I'm just going to read mine now.
the opening line is, Eliza has never seen a land that looks so very much like blood, because in the Kimberley and in Broome, the soil is bright red.
It's
and
such
you
a
can
great
imagine
line.
approaching that on a ship, having come from the sort of smog and smut of London and coming over and just seeing this fiery red landscape. So I had to think about it, but I remembered one.
That's a good idea.
That's a really good answer, though.
Yes.
Go on, Kate. Best description.
Best description. Look, honestly, that is like you're asking me to like mentally scroll through 20,000.
What's your opening line?
I can do my opening line, but I don't think opening lines are not my. So this is from Beth's perspective. So she's one of the barmaids. So the opening line is, when Lauren found me, I was sitting on the sticky floor, flicking the plug socket switch that powered the lights on and off, staring into space. So I wouldn't say it's more of a kind of leading into more.
It's intriguing.
I'd like to think it's intriguing. I have some. I think also my phrases would be more dialogue, I suppose. I'm more of a. I like hearing people talk, I suppose. Is how I would see it. But I will read the whole book again. I will write down my favourite phrase. Because also, I wrote this 2 years ago now. So this is that when authors are doing publicity, it's normally 2 years after.
Yeah, I think mine must have been 3 years ago.
Yeah,
and that's finishing writing it. Mine took about 10
Yeah.
years to write, to research and write. And so when it's impossible to remember.
Yeah, well, I've written 2 books since that.
Yeah.
So I've got. But you know what? I mean, the book that I've just finished. If you asked me what's the best description, I couldn't call that to mind. I'll have to start making notes of this the next time I get asked a question.
Well, we've got someone watching called Amita who said that she loved your book, Emma and Lizzie, and she can't wait to read yours, Kate.
Oh, thank you, Amita.
Bye, Amita.
So
lovely to
hopefully
see you
she'll go
here.
around and some purchasing. One of our group's favourite questions to ask is, what is your most memorable moments as an author so far?
Ooh. As in what the experience of writing the books, or
Just anything.
I mean, I do a lot of I do a lot of research personally. So recently I went to stay with some nuns in the Sacré-Cœur, and I had I don't know if I can say this, but okay. So no one tell these nuns this. but the food in nunneries, convents, not the best, because it's on the kind of austere side, and I had my kind of non being in a convent manners, which would be when someone brings a meal to the table, no matter what the meal is, you would say, "Oh, that looks so delicious, I'm going to load up my plate." So I did that foolishly, without really looking at the food, and then I realised halfway through the meal that obviously I can't leave any food on my plate, because the convent,
Yeah.
no one's going to appreciate, no one's going to appreciate the guest who wasted the food. And one of the dishes was this like sort of oh, sorry, because they were so lovely too. But it was like an old, very old banana that had been sort of steeped in orange juice. And I really don't like bananas either. So I'm just gonna, I'm sure that banana would have been delicious to a lot of people. I kind of managed to eat half of it, and then I had to, while people's backs were turned, sort of sneak it into a napkin. And put it in my bag, and I was like, what am I going to do with it? Because I was in this convent, I can't put it in the bin because someone will find, the nuns probably are the ones who are emptying the bins, so I had to sort of sneak it off and flush it down the toilet. Does that count as a memorable? That's like a bad.
Yeah, definitely. You flushed it down the loo.
It's definitely memorable.
Because how else? They would have definitely known it was me if anyone. All eyes were everywhere, and it was like me and like two other people in this convent staying over. Kind of assuming that I'm enjoying the grace of God, going to prayers, that sort of business. So yeah, I would have definitely been. They would have found me out so quick.
That's a good answer. I was not expecting that sort of story to come up.
I was not either, but that's a brilliant answer.
Thanks.
I'd say mine. I got to do some awesome research for this book, and that did involve going back out to Australia a few times, sort of walking the landscapes that my characters would walk, trying on hard hat helmets, watching whales teach their calves how to breach from sort of like amazing sort of wildlife experience.
Oh, wow.
Crocodiles, things like that, and that was incredible. But actually the one thing that I will never forget, and actually probably is my most memorable moment, so my character Eliza Brightwell is loosely based on a real woman, who was a woman called Eliza Broadhurst, and she was essentially an early feminist. She, didn't sort of adhere to societal norms. She was quite modern in that sense. She set up a school in the outback. She survived shipwrecks and storms, and she was just a badass, basically. And I sort of mention her in my author's note at the back of my book. And one day I got an email, and it turns out the email was from the real Eliza Broadhurst's great-great-granddaughter. And she had picked up my book, and she was taking it on holiday with her, and she was very excited to be reading it, and sort of glad that her ancestor was being sort of providing inspiration. But I just never thought that sort of thing would happen when I was writing the book. And similarly, I've had people who get in touch whose great-grandparents were pearl divers, or they were forced to dive for pearls, and that's something that I touch on in the book as well, and they've said, oh, isn't it cool that we're talking about these stories now? And I think those, and I don't want to do that, hearing from readers is the lovely bit, but it is lovely. It's so nice, because it's very easy as an author to sort of exist in a bubble and forget that there are people out there picking up your books and reading your work, and it's such an amazing privilege to get an email from someone saying, oh, hey, I read this and I thought it was cool. So that's mine.
That's a very cool story.
Thanks.
That is really awesome. Yes.
How about you, Emma? Most memorable bit?
Yeah, well, mine would not be a research. I mean, so many, but the big one I have to say would have to be being on the New Blood panel at the Harrogate, the Theakston Orbiculia Crime Writing Festival, with meeting Val McDermid and being on that panel, which was just the most amazing thing. And it was kind of, I was terrified. I was terrified because my book had only actually got published the day before, or 2 days before. It came out on the Thursday, which is like the first night of the festival, and our panel was lunchtime on the Saturday. And look, I was so happy. I was so excited, but I honestly really was terrified because I knew it was the first time I would ever speak publicly about the book. It was the first bit of publicity I would do, and it was going to be the biggest thing of the whole year. Might be the biggest thing I ever do in my entire career. So let's see. But anyway, that was amazing. And I was on the panel with Stacey Willingham and Michael Bennett, and Bella Mackie was also meant to join us, but in the end she couldn't at the last minute, which was a shame for her. But it was great doing it with Stacey and Michael because Stacey was so polished and cool. Well, they're both the loveliest people, but Stacey was she'd spoken about her book heaps. It was already like a New York Times bestseller, and so she was totally cool about everything. She might have been nervous, but she did not appear to be nervous. Michael was as terrified as me, so that was really great. And his book hadn't yet come out. So it was just lovely to have that. And the three of us had met and chatted a little bit beforehand. But I really surprised myself. Like I said, I was terrified until I started talking, and then I just really enjoyed it. And I mean, honestly, you could not have a better crowd than that Harrogate crowd of like 800 or so people who are just massive crime fiction fans. So that will remain a highlight.
Did you have 800 people at your event?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it was fully booked, and I think that's how many people fit in to that tent.
It's pretty big as Harrogate, isn't it? Like, once you're in there.
Yeah, it's big, but it's also so friendly and lovely. So it's just the loveliest atmosphere, actually.
How did you cope with the nerves?
Well, a friend of mine afterwards said, Emma, you really looked terrified at the beginning.
But they probably knew. I don't think anyone else notices. It's like your friends would know, right?
Yeah, I just thought, I mean, look, I've done a lot of scary things in my life, more like scary physical, sporty things. And so I don't really know how I coped with the nerves, Lizzie, but I just kind of, I think once we got into the chatting, I realised it was fine. And also Michael started, and thank goodness we went alphabetically. So he started, and because I knew he was nervous, but he's a New Zealander, he's a Maori guy. He opened in Maori, which was just the most kind of beautiful thing, and just I think that really sorted me out because I just was so moved by him doing that, and he said this beautiful thing thanking the Val and everybody, and then I realized I probably would not have remembered to thank anybody at all, so I thought thank goodness first. So yeah, I think it was the people that got me over my nerves, basically.
I remember sitting in the crowd at Harrogate this year thinking, I am very glad that I'm not like up on the stage doing anything. Because the crowd is so big, it's terrifying.
Yeah, but you know what? You can't see, you can see like the front row, and people you can't really see, like it's quite dark out there. Like I knew my editor was sitting in the front row, but I could hardly see him. So even the front row was quite dim. I think that did help, actually.
Sometimes it's worse to not. So when my book came out in Australia, I did Australian breakfast TV, but from my desk here in London.
Oh, wow.
And it was the scariest thing I've ever done in my life.
Yeah,
but essentially, I was just looking at a black screen with the logo of the sort of news channel on it. And I could just hear the presenter talking to me, and knew that I was being sort of projected on this screen, but I couldn't see that. I couldn't see who I was talking to or anyone in the audience. And actually, I think it's better to be able to see people.
Yes, be that way.
Yes. So you can sort of
go native, don't they? Like in like that sort of, because I don't know anything about TV and radio, and I did like a radio thing once, and it's like, because they are so aware that they do it day in day out. Yes. It's like to them, they're like, okay, next guest, or but like, so it feels like it's very hard to know what's happening.
Exactly. Nice and you can get an energy from an audience and sort of gauge people's reactions and see hopefully some smiling faces, which I'm sure, well, as you said, Emma, sort of helped you.
Yes, it did, because although I couldn't see people very clearly, there was great energy in that room. I mean, great, just very also, I'll tell you what also helped when we met, because I had met Val the day before, and then just in the green room, she was like, okay, these are the questions I'm going to ask you. They're dead easy. So she goes through these questions, which of course they go straight in one ear and out the other.
Yeah.
But mainly, she was just like, this crowd, they just want to love you and they want to love your books. So you don't have anything to worry about. And I think that's absolutely true. In fact, it's going to be true of most things. Like, people come to things because for that, right? And
they're not trying to trip you up. They just want to know about your book.
Yeah, which is a lovely thing to talk about. And I tell you what, that one of the, and I didn't, of course, because for Lizzie and me, it's our first book. So not knowing really what to expect or what is expected of us has been a big part of the last couple of years. But I just didn't I thought I would like it, but I didn't realize what a amazing thing it is to be able to talk to people about your book. It's almost like there's no better thing, because we spend all of this time writing these books, and there is so much of us in these books, for everybody who's written a book, and then what a joy and a privilege to have people want to read them and want to hear us talk about them. It's like the best thing. Yeah.
It's what me and Sam, who do the author chats, think about running the author chats. We just think it's a joy and privilege to talk to you guys about your books as well.
Oh, well, thank you.
Best job in the world, getting to talk to authors about their books. It's brilliant. So you've all written these wonderfully fascinating books set in Australia. What's the one kind of misconception about Australia you would like to address? If you could? So obviously you've researched yours brilliantly, you've all been there, you've grown up there. What's the thing that you think people think about Australia that you'd like to sort of correct?
I think
I've got
yeah, you go, Kate. You go, Kate.
Well, so I think the main misconception I had, well, it's a small one, but it's more of an authory one. I'm sure you guys found this too, that there's in England, there's an idea that Australia is, Australia's giant. And what happens in the editing process is if there's someone around from Australia, like the continent, they will be roped in to give expert advice on the place you're writing. And it would be the equivalent of getting so I had someone from Sydney who was really helpful to have, but the idea, the sort of feeling in the editorial offices was, well, this person will know everything about Australia, but in reality, it's like getting someone who lives in Chelsea to comment on inner city Manchester. It's so completely different that you can't there would obviously be some congruities, but mainly it's not the same place, right? that would be the sort of myth, the main thing, I suppose, which is, that's more of an author myth, isn't it? Oh, and that you can get Tim Tams in vending machines.
The thing I'd say is probably more of like a historical thing, I think, because this is not everybody at all, but there are still some people on this planet who think that there was nobody living in Australia when white people arrived on the shores of Australia. And that was obviously categorically not true. And white settlement of Australia meant the displacement, the slaughter, the dispossession of Aboriginal people who had been living there for tens of thousands of years before anybody turned up on the shores of Australia. And so I just think that's, it's fascinating history to delve into. It's dark and it's brutal and it's sort of confronting, but it just adds to what I think is a really, really complex and fascinating country. And there's so much more to be said about that sort of aspect of Australia. So I think that's what I'd say.
Yeah, I think all of us do address that some aspects of that, even though Cate and I are not writing historical. I think you're right, Lizzie, that I feel like we're slowly being, I don't know, very slowly just starting to look at history in a more truthful way, but there's still a long way to go. Certainly we were not taught truthful history when I was at school, and I don't know what the situation is now. So yeah, I think that's a good, that's a huge thing, that you're right, that I suspect is still a misconception among many people. But I do think people are starting to be more, wanting to learn difficult truths and redress, all of those, redress that 200 years of painful history and trauma, and however you want to put it. Yeah, I think in terms of, in the sense, when you asked that question, Kaz, the thing that came to mind was probably a bit like what Cate said, in terms of, I guess, the process of editing No Country for Girls was very interesting, because I was doing it with my editor has never been to Australia, but he loved the landscape in the book. So that was something which obviously was one of the reasons he bought the book, I do think. So also, we were in the middle of lockdown, and here this book landed on his desk that was about a road trip through outback Australia when we couldn't travel. So I think that escapist aspect did appeal to him, but he didn't know anything about that landscape. So it was really interesting doing an edit with him. It was actually really good, because he wanted to know more about the landscape. So he kind of drew the landscape out of me in a way that I did not expect a UK editor would necessarily do. So I suppose in terms of a misconception that people would have about Australia, perhaps if they haven't been, or even if some people have been, because many people, if you go for a 3-week or just a couple of weeks holiday, you can only see a tiny part. So I think it's a misconception that all of it is like that desert, all of it is like that arid red dirt. And Australia has so many different incredible landscapes. And to go back to Lizzie's point, those and hundreds of different First Nations groups and languages, like, I don't know how many, but like maybe at least 600 or something. I don't know exactly. So there is this incredible diversity of landscape and culture and language within the country that many people wouldn't necessarily about. That's a bit of a long answer to your question.
It's a good one, and we're going to go completely in a different direction with Laura's question now.
I've seen this in the chat.
Which is, where do you stand on fairy bread? Is it ever appropriate to use something other than butter? I know what fairy bread is, which is good, but she said a TikToker used cinnamon crunch bread instead, which is just wrong on many levels. Cinnamon is lovely. Where does
I'd eat that.
Yeah.
Well, personally, I do not think I would. I'm a bit of a stickler for the classic fairy bread, so I don't think I would. Look, I'm open. I'd be open to trying an alternative, but I haven't had fairy bread for a long time, and I do like the classic version.
Yeah, I'm with. It's not fairy bread, right? It's sprinkles and butter on white bread. Like, otherwise, it's something else. It's cinnamon crunch, whatever. Stop calling it fairy bread.
Oh, I'm not a purist. I'd have any incarnation that was thrown my way.
Really?
Fair enough. Well, I mean, it brought us back to a light note, didn't it? I wonder if Laura's been to Australia.
Yeah, I reckon.
Yeah, do you know what fairy bread is?
Talking about fairy bread,
right? Like, you don't have those sort of strong views, do you? Because fairy bread's not an English thing, right? We don't have fairy bread at kids' parties in England.
No,
not to my knowledge. No.
I don't think so, but we do have very strong opinions, don't we, about our traditional things in England, like naming our food and what it should consist of, and things like that. So, well, Laura is the one who often asks the question of, have you ever acted out a scene in your book, as you've written it? So, in her honour, well, while we're on Laura's questions, let's ask that one.
Okay,
we did have this discussion before, didn't we? Whenever you start.
Okay, I'll go, because I when you mentioned that question before, Kaz, I thought, oh no, I've never done that. But actually, no, I have done that, and it's usually not with anyone else. It's usually by myself, but it's the physical things, like a fight, just trying to choreograph a fight. So in that very early scene at the end of chapter 1, where Charlie is having a physical confrontation with her sister Gina's boyfriend Daryl, and he gets her up against the fridge. He kind of has her shirt and he's twisting it, and she's quite small and he's huge, so he's basically choking her. So I did a lot of pressing myself up against the wall and trying to figure out how to choreograph this particular thing that has to happen between the two of them. And I also did I did some amazing research for that, because I found this, which many people will probably know about, this group on Facebook called Trauma Fiction, where people ask these incredible questions about, usually medical, but often people who are writing crime fiction about medical or injuries or whatever. And there are amazing people in that group, and very, very generous with their comments and their time. People who have either worked they either work as doctors or paramedics, or they work in law enforcement, or they have been, victims of crime. So anyway, I had some amazing responses when I asked about choking in that group. I mean, incredible people who personally that.
Wow.
I did act it out. Yes, I did act it out.
Because you end up with really weird Google searches.
Oh my god!
It's like the FBI or something gonna pick this up one day, that I'm quite clearly, trying to find ways to murder someone.
Yeah, Google search is the worst. Fights are the hardest thing to write, aren't they? Because you have to get the sort of physicality and the directions of it right. And mine's exactly the same. I have a scene in my book where there's like a room with a table of stolen pearls at the back, and there's people in the room having fights with a gun and a nut, you know, like really so many moving parts of that scene. And you just have to get someone to say, hang on, can you stand there and do this and do this? But the only other thing that I've sort of not acted out, but had to go to it to visualize, I was in Australia in this sort of mangrove swamp in a little boat, crocodiles everywhere. And my question to the person who was driving the boat was, could that tree bear the weight of a human, or would the human fall into the water and be eaten by the crocodiles? And that was for research purposes for my book. And they looked at me very strangely. But some things you just have to see and you have to experience to be able to work out if they're actually going to make any sense of your book.
Yeah. So could the tree bear the weight? I need to know the answer now.
Well, you'll have to read the book to find out.
It's really scary, that scene. It's really scary, that scene. And I tell you what, crocodiles are one thing, saltwater crocodiles are one thing that I find really frightening. I mean, they are
with good reason.
Yeah, with good reason. You know, they stalk people and wait underneath trees, and they're very patient. And so, yeah, that's very scary.
But at least you can see them, right? There's things in Australia, like the irukandji jellyfish in Australia, which is about the size of a fingernail, actually about the size of a little fingernail. You can't see it, but it can kill you.
Yeah.
You know, there's so much about that landscape that you can't see, but will probably do quite a lot of harm. Not everything, that's probably a misconception about Australia, but there are some good nasties there that can serve as a plot device in your book.
Yes.
What about you, Cate? You acted out a scene?
Well, ironically, I have not really, because I think it's because I'm quite aggressive. Like, I'm a really aggressive person, and I spent a lot of time fighting when I was little. Like, not when I was like a little kid, but it makes me sound really weird. And I asked someone else this the other day, because I said, oh, when I was like sort of 6 or 7, when it was like playtime, I would come out of playtime and I had a little gang. We would just go and have fights with people, and that's what we do, have little dust-ups. And it turns out I'm the only girl who ever did that. And thinking back, it was all boys we were fighting. So no, I don't. But what I do, I've realised, which is even weirder than the childhood fighting thing, is I put on like loud music, like in headphones, and sort of march around the streets of my small, beautiful rural town and kind of vividly imagine, you know, like these sort of like punch up scenes. So that's kind of just a strange. So I guess, you know, if anyone sees me walking on the high street,
cross the road,
slightly muttering to myself, you know, kind of vaguely sort of. So that's not the same as acting it out, is it? I never have. I probably should, but I'm a terrible actress. I'm not. That's not my bag at all. Just
There'll be people in your town though going, no, don't mind, that's resident author.
Yeah, probably. And
exactly.
Or, you know, yeah. It comes with the territory, doesn't it? Being a bit odd.
Yeah.
I need to rope you in as a fight consultant on my next book.
Sounds like
well, I need to get you guys in, don't I? Because you've actually acted it out. I'd be rubbish. Probably if it actually really happened, I'd fall apart, wouldn't I? Probably just turn into a ball and scream, and you guys would have the moves. You'd be like, we've practiced this.
It's not just restrained to authors either. My students at school asked me the other day if I thought I was on some kind of watch list as a science teacher for things I googled.
Yeah, sure.
Quite possibly. But, Laura says she's not been to Australia. She made fairy bread as part of Australian theme.
Yeah, that's cool.
That's a shocking twist.
I think it's actually why I knew what it was as well.
Oh, really?
Very similar, yeah. Definitely. So one of my favourite questions currently is, what's been your read of the year so far? What have you enjoyed reading recently and would recommend?
I have to say Emma's book. I have to say Emma's book. It was
Emma's
like
book is
such a
amazing.
good book. I had a big pile of books to read, and I'm enjoying all of them actually. But I went to a book signing event where Emma was one of the speakers, and I bought all the books at that event. And I can't remember the order I started them, but certainly Emma's was the first one I finished by a mile. And that's not to say the others weren't ripping, because they were. But yeah, definitely Emma's. It's so beautiful, so gripping, moves so fast, and yet you kind of engage with all the characters. It's just brilliant. I love that book.
I do too. It's an incredible book. And what I thought was really interesting about Emma's book is it's so voicey. The voices of these two characters just leap off the page. You know, it's so fresh and so exhilarating. I've read road trip novels before, but it's unique in it's the way that these sort of female characters are voiced. The other book that I'd love to shout out, because I think it's amazing and it's coming out in paperback soon, is Breathless by Amy McCulloch, which is basically the hook is serial killer on a mountain, basically, and you're up the mountain, you've got nowhere to go. So it's about a journalist called Cecily Wong who climbs one of the world's highest mountains alongside a famous mountaineer in order to get sort of a scoop on his story. And once they get to the top of this very icy, inhospitable mountain, they realize there's a serial killer up there with them. And that's out in paperback at the end of this month, I think, and I love that. And like Emma's book too, it's just got such great sense of place, and it's just really a page turner.
There was a big trend for cold
Definitely.
places. Did you notice that, like the sanatorium and Shiver?
Yes.
And I think just people I felt like there was the trend for cold water swimming as well. It's almost like everyone had to be like, we just got to turn it off. We just got to get really cold, so we can't do any of this stuff. And then I'm hoping there will now be a swing to like hot books.
Yeah.
Hot books.
Yeah. Or nice like peaceful island settings with murders. Yeah.
Yeah, with murders.
I absolutely loved both of Cate and Lizzie's books, and yeah, both of which blew me away in terms of the sense of place, and they've both got a great mystery, and yeah, I mean, look, I love reading books set in Australia. I won't lie. There's so many books I could shout about. So read of the year is kind of challenging. But anyway, I'm going to say something about Michael's book, Better the Blood, Michael Bennett.
Ooh, nice cover.
Yes, amazing, isn't it? Also, he has they made him a really cool book trailer, which is awesome. So Michael's on that New Blood panel with me, and I tell you what, this is a remarkable book, and it's a serial killer story set in Auckland. It's contemporary, but he has managed amazingly skillfully to write this contemporary story with very, very vivid characters, utterly believable. But it's also about the bloody colonial history of New Zealand. And so that to me is just this amazing achievement. And it's a bloody great read. And it's about a Maori detective called Hannah Westerman, and she's basically investigating this crime. So she has her own complex history with her Maori background. Yeah, she's just a fascinating character. And that's a series that I'm guessing that will be a series.
Is it being adapted for TV?
I don't know, but he's a filmmaker, Michael, and he's made, I think, at least 2 documentaries. So I think he was a filmmaker before he ever started writing. So, and oh no, actually, he's made a documentary more recently. I know he's written and been involved with I'm sure it's a drama also. So I wouldn't be surprised if that ends up being
like Mystery Road, but in New Zealand.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yes. Oh, I love Mystery
So
Road.
do I.
We'll sneak in a Mita's question and then finish off with like a recap of your books so people can go away and buy them. She said she's curious if any of you could have written your books and not set them in Australia, or was the setting almost like a character?
Ooh.
Good question. Great question. I couldn't have, because mine is so tied into an industry that was linked to Western Australia, so the pearl diving trade and that. But I do always start with setting. It's interesting where people start their books from. People, you know, some people might have the idea of a character in their head, or they might have the idea of a crime or a hook, whereas mine is always setting, because I have to spend so much time in that story and in that place. And I'm a travel journalist as well, and so it's sort of part of my writing process. Sense of place is part of my writing process, that I always pick a place before I sort of start writing a story, if that makes sense. Even though I didn't choose to go Australia and write this story, but I knew that I was going to write about Australia. But I'm interested to hear what you two is answer to that one, because my answer is I couldn't have, but could you?
I would have said the same as you. And I'm also a travel
Are you?
journalist, so
Oh.
travel journalist high five. Or before the books, so that would have been a little while back now. But so I would have said no, yeah, that it's all to do with the setting. But then my American publisher wasn't sure about setting it in Australia only for the commercial aspect of selling it. They weren't convinced that anyone other than Jane Harper could do it. So they asked me if I could set it somewhere else. I think that's how the conversation went, and it turns out I could, and I looked into Arizona and was really amazed actually by the congruities between not so much the setting, but actually a lot to do with the indigenous past, and how it was actually horrific to see to discover how similar that process of sort of stealing the resources from the native people was, and obviously there were differences, but actually in terms of where my book was set, Arizona had mining, it had kind of that bar culture a bit, not quite the same way. It wasn't quite so remote, but that didn't end up being such a problem. So yeah, I think so. I don't know.
So hang on. So did you then write the book?
I went to Arizona. I then wrote the book in Arizona. The American publishers now want to do the other book first, or some different order.
Oh my gosh! So you've got two versions of the same book.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't. It sounds. Mostly, it was changing the dialogue. Actually, that was the issue. But bearing in mind that the two central characters were American, so theirs didn't change at all. So it was the sort of surrounding characters' speech had to change, and the sort of the guys, the sort of real good Aussie blokes, that was really hard actually, because my ear was so in that dialogue, or I'd like to think it was, that when I sort of couldn't get that, but they actually, those guys only have about 10 paragraphs scattered throughout the whole book, so it was less of an undertaking than you might have thought, and I got the excuse to go on a super lightning fast research trip to Arizona, which was like amazing.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Cool. That is amazing that you did that. Yeah, so that's interesting hearing both of you answer this, because I would I couldn't imagine myself doing it, because I am always driven by landscape and love for the landscape, or so far I have been. But at a push, yes, I could have done it, and I would have said it in the States similarly, because I mean, it would have been at a big push for me to want to do it. But, you know, I was hugely influenced by Thelma and Louise, the movie, and also Cormac McCarthy's amazing book, No Country for Old Men, and that movie, actually, both the book and the movie. So I could have imagined my book there, but maybe I would have to, I mean, a lot of people do comment on the voice aspect, so that would be a huge challenge for me, not writing Australian characters. I think that would be a huge challenge, but maybe I would just put 2 Australian backpackers into that
Yeah.
Sure, why not?
landscape.
Do you think you'll write
cool.
about other
That
places
would
in
be
the
fun.
future, Emma,
So,
or do you think you'll always stick with Australia?
I'm quite sure I will write about other places. It's interesting because if I decide to move back to Australia, which I might, and I often think about, that will change things. I think it's sometimes almost easier to write about somewhere when you're away from it, because, or for me anyway, the longing for the place has absolutely fueled my writing. So yes, I could well imagine I will write about other places in the future.
Good answer. And we're at the end of our time, so if we finish off with you just reminding people about your books, show off the covers again, so that if they've watched and enjoyed it, they know where to go and what to go and buy.
Cool. Okay.
Do you want to start, Emma? Or do you
I'll
want,
start.
Or we all...
So
Okay.
also just to say thank you, Kaz, and thank you, Lizzie and Cate, for coming along, and for Kaz for hosting us, Lizzie and Cate for joining me, and everyone who's come along. Yeah, it's just been great. As I said, there's no better thing than talking about our books. So yeah, it's a reminder: No Country for Girls, Thelma and Louise Meets the Tourist, and it's available in all the usual places. It's currently, this is the hardback, which has these beautiful green end papers. The paperback doesn't come out till next April, but actually until the end of October you can get it on ebook for 99p, so that's a bargain. Yeah,
Can't go wrong.
Yeah, that is a bargain.
Okay, I'll go. So, Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter. This is the UK cover. There's a different cover if you're in the States. It's purple with some mangroves, and a different cover in Australia. But it's out now in all of those places. Dangerous pearl diving, smuggling, shipwrecks, adventure, crime in sweltering Western Australia.
It sounds amazing. It's definitely my next book to read.
Thanks, Gail. I need to read yours too. It sounds amazing.
Well, you might get confused with Emma's because look how similar the covers are. Emma, hold yours up. They look so similar, right? Although I'm now curious as to the colour of my green.
Oh.
But it's a lovely cover, and I do love it.
It's a lovely
and I think
cover.
there must be something in that sort of dusty road type of look. So this is the my book Blood Sisters. It was I think Heat Magazine's book of the week or month, I believe. It was Sunday Times crime book of the or in their crime roundup for the month, I should say. It's 2 backpackers in the frame for murder in an outback Aussie bar, and I guess you have to decide A, if they did it, and B, if the dead guy deserved it, which is something I had a lot of fun thinking about. But I should also say thank you so much to Emma for inviting me along, and Kaz for hosting me, and Lizzie for introducing me to another amazing book. I'm so excited to read it.
Thank you too.
And everyone should go grab all those books if you haven't already.
I'm sure they will. Well, Laura said that all 3 sound fab, and her main decision will be which to buy and read first.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Bread while you read them.
Which is a good note to end on. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
thanks everyone. Thanks for coming.